Now, speaking of immediate change, a video was just released today that you were in for the ACLU of Colorado. And you, along with a few other NFL athletes, were asking the Colorado governor to safely release inmates who are medically vulnerable and may be imprisoned during the COVID-19 pandemic. You also spoke about and highlighted the fact that Black and brown people are what make up the majority of those in the United States who are in prison. So kind of talk about why you wanted to get involved with this, why exactly you wanted to spread this message amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and really give a highlight and recognition to our communities of color who are currently in jail.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest proponents in terms of kind of like racial inequalities and everything that has to do with racism in our country. I think one of the biggest things is when you look at mass incarceration, and anyone that knows Brian Stevenson or looks at his work with everything that he does, and then you look at some documentaries or you read some books, you look at mass incarceration and you take a step back, and it's really eye-opening to see the numbers in terms of, the minority but the majority in prison. And it's just staggering. And I think there's been a rhetoric, or, there's been a stereotype of, certain minorities in certain places where it's just hard to put yourself in people's shoes when you've never been a part of their lives and what they've had to go through and things like that. And when you look at it, it's another way to have modern day slavery. Because anyone that knows, like, when you get, or for the most part, anyone that finally gets out of their prison sentence or jail sentence or anything like that, like, it's hard to get a job. And when it's hard to get a job, you go back to means to try and find ways to provide for your family. And sometimes those means are against the law. And it's not a fact of not wanting to get those things done. In terms of getting a job, it's hard. That's how our system is right now. It's hard to get a job when you've been in prison. And sometimes when you're in neighborhoods where mom is working 4 or 5 jobs at a time, you don't have the money to be able to play sports, and after school activities are limited because you don't have parental guidance, you don't have all these things. You just get caught in bad situations. That's why I was saying, it's hard to put yourself in people's shoes when you've never been there yourself. Now, it's not an excuse at all, but it's just the reality of the fact that this is what a lot of, minority people are dealing with in our country, which is why, circling that back, which is why I think it's so important to invest into our youth and to help them and to educate them and to empower them, because no, you don't need to fall victim to your circumstance. And you can get yourself out of that situation. But a lot of the times there are not going to be a lot of people that aren't going to help you with that. And so I think looking at, and I'm kind of bouncing topics, but looking at what a few guys on the Broncos have talked about with the governor, we've looked at mass incarceration and during this pandemic, and how, for the most part, our prison systems aren't great with health and monitoring that, right? And then you look at what our prison systems are in place for, and then you look at the guidelines that we need to take, 6 feet apart, mask, social distancing, all these things. It's almost impossible to do that in our prisons. And so when you look at, and the thing that we talked about with Governor Polis in Colorado, when you look at nonviolent crimes that people are in jail for, high risk of COVID exposure, they have stable homes to return to. For those that can work, they have jobs set up where they are able to work and to provide to society in a positive way. When you look at all those factors within our prison systems, it's almost a no-brainer that he can use his clemency powers to release some of these folks so that they can be reunited with their families and ultimately get a second chance at life. And so I don't know about the people on this call or you yourself, Kimmi, but I know for me, if it wasn't for a few people that in my life gave me a second chance, boy, I would be here doing what I'm doing. you know, we talked about all the great accolades, kind of like before we got into the conversation. None of those would have been existent if it wasn't for a few select individuals in my life that gave me a second chance to kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say prove my worth, but just to kind of like right some of my wrongs. And so ultimately, that's all we're asking of our governor is there's so many people in prison that are in our prisons right now that are nonviolent, you know, are at high risk of exposure for COVID, have safe homes to return to, have stable jobs to return to, aren't threats to society, that deserve a second chance at an opportunity to live their life and to show the greater good in humanity instead of ultimately sentencing them to their deaths with COVID running amok in our country. And it's just sad that even after having a conversation with him and it seeming like he understood and was really listening to kind of like the stories from some of the guys that were on that call, it's really sad that even after all that, he had only granted clemency to I think 4 people, and I don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure out of those 4, like, you know, their sentence or their time was coming up shortly anyways. And so it's just sad because you know, this is a hard time for a lot of people in our country, and it's just sad that, you know, those families still have to go through what they go through. And I'm happy for the 4 families that are receiving you know, their people back in their lives, but for the other families, families like Ron Johnson, and his daughter Amber Johnson's been fighting for him for so long. It's just really sad that the governor isn't exercising his clemency powers.